So I'm based in Riverside, UCR. And if you were to send me questions after today, please put in the subject line that it's Master Gardener Program from today, so that my brain can go to that channel. And otherwise, if there's no subject line, I delete you. So, because I get hundreds of emails a day. So, not to be mean, but trying to be efficient. Okay, so the goals of today's program basically is what is the difference between drought resistant and drought tolerant plants. You will understand that when we're finished. You should. And how are some plants drought resistant? We're going to go through that. And then how are some plants drought tolerant? So I like to just, I think Janet has gone through some of this as well, but there are advantages of ground covers depending on the type of ground cover. One is weed prevention, keeps weeds down. I do not like weeding. It's my most least favorite thing in gardening. Ground covers with proper selection can mitigate the heat island effect, as Janet was saying. And then ground covers are aesthetically appealing. They can also help with erosion control and then also with animal control. But with that in mind, there are disadvantages to ground covers as well. One, it's a maintenance issue. You have to be able to maintain it. Nothing is maintenance free. And then there are water requirements if you're using plant material. And there's a cooling or heating impact depending on the type of ground cover. If you use rocks, a lot of people are taking the desert route and putting in just a lot of gravel. And gravel can be very hot. It's just like cement. And so that can be a disadvantage. Cooling is usually an advantage in most cases nowadays. The other thing with ground covers is that there can be water competition with plants in proximity. So while the previous talk was focusing on trees, this talk and the next talks are going to focus on ground covers. And keep in mind that when you put a ground cover in, some that are very thirsty plants and have the ability to get water will compete with the trees and shrubs in the area. So you have to keep that into consideration, take that into consideration. The other thing is ground covers are very nice because they can hide little critters as they're crawling and squirming around in the garden. And so that protects them from birds and stuff that can come down and get them. So it can also be an attractant for rodents and stuff. So keep that in mind as well. And then, like I said earlier, adding to the heat island problem would be if you were using rocks or artificial turf. I live in Riverside, and between Riverside and Corona, and my neighbors have artificial turf, and they can't walk on it in the summertime. And they were also told that it was going to last 10 years, and it's lasted 5 years. It's fading. So I don't know where some of these tests are done with artificial turf. My guess is maybe closer to the coast, where it's not as hot and the sun is not as intense. Our sun comes out around during May, gray, June gloom. Sun usually comes out around 11. Here lately, it's been coming out of the fog around 9:30 in the morning. It's a little earlier in the day. But keep that in mind if people try to study artificial turf, that they may be testing these things over on coastal areas, or maybe even in the Northwest, where the sun is not nearly as intense as it is here in Southern California. Okay, so being a Northeastern person, I've been mesmerized by California native plants and by the desert plants of the Southwest and how they survive. And when I see anything green in the middle of July out in the desert, it just blows my mind away. So we need to understand how some plants are adapting to this and how this works. And so I'm going to go over the mechanisms of drought tolerance in xerophytes. And we can break it down into three groups: drought avoiders, drought resistors, and drought endurers. And then we're going to go into a classification scheme of drought stress response classification. There's isohydric and anisohydric. And once you understand these principles, hopefully eventually there will be more labels for plant material and what type of mechanisms they have for drought tolerance. Some are easily seen, others are not, because it's a process that occurs in the root system. So let's go. Okay, let's talk about drought avoiders. So annual plants are those that avoid drought by growing and completing their life cycle during the wet season and surviving the dry season as seeds. And if you go out into the desert, or if you go into some of the hills out here, you will see that there will be a cycle of blooming in the springtime during a rainy season. And a lot of the poppies and stuff will grow and flower during this wet cycle. And they will set seed, and then they will go dormant. So our hills will be very colorful for a few weeks or a month. And then these plants will quickly set seed, and these seeds will last for decades, as we found out a few years ago when we had the perfect wet season and people were stopping along the 15 to take photographs of the hillsides. So that was interesting. But these are called drought avoiders because they can grow and complete their life cycle in one wet season. What are drought resistors? Okay, this is where it gets a little bit more confusing. There are different types of drought resistors, and these are plants that avoid drought. They avoid these dry seasons by using water sparingly or storing the water to be used during the dry times. And if you live out in this area, you'll see Anisohydric Plants. There's other species that grow out in the desert. And these plants will actually have, they have a couple mechanisms. Anisohydric Plants will have an extensive root system, but then the leaves that are on the plant come out during the wet season, and they flower and can go dormant, and the leaves will drop off once the dry season occurs. So this is a very interesting plant in terms of it doing that. This year, these did not bloom very well, except in the riparian areas where there's water accumulated down into the soil. Another interesting note about Anisohydric is that during wet years, you have more green on the plant. The leaves are less hairy, and so they'll appear more green. In the dry years, they will be grayer because there's more leaf hairs on there to conserve water. The saguaro cactus on the right stores water in its columns. And this is very interesting because you can notice out if you go out to Tucson, you'll see these plants. And when they suffer a drought, the column actually shrinks and can get very desiccated during the dry years. You do not see saguaros on the west side of the Colorado naturally, because there's not enough summer water to keep these things alive. But when you get over to the Tucson, Phoenix area, where they have summer monsoonal moisture, these plants can survive year round. Okay, drought resistors. These are plants that develop large, extensive root systems to acquire water. Some palms, mesquite, and ocotillo. So you can see here on the far left, there's a Brahia armata that I have there, that's in my yard. And these have they're like a large grass. And so they can have a fairly large root system to accumulate water. I make a note with this. Here's the center plant is an ocotillo planted in someone's yard. And if you look closely, I don't know if you can see my pointer, you can see there's a dripper placed right there at the plant. And this plant fell over, it lodged, and they had to put a stake in it. And the reason being is because if you look on the right, you can see an ocotillo where the roots have been exposed. There's an extensive root system. And these plants have evolved to acquire water in these brief rain periods that we do have, to get the roots further out and to acquire as much water as they can in these brief rain events. And so you need to be aware that poorly spaced strippers or improper irrigation will cause tree death or tree instability, because the mechanisms of water, of drought resistance, is in the root system here, and it has to have an extensive root system. This plant here is still kind of this way after 3 years, because the homeowner is too lazy, because I told them, to put drippers around this yard to get this root system to be developed more extensively. So sometimes these plants will grow, but what will happen is there will be a wind event, and even something with low resistance like an ocotillo will blow over because it may have just one root or two keeping it upright. Okay, next slide. Okay, drought endurers. Drought endurers, again, are plants that can adapt to dehydration. And these are our wonderful Encilia on the left. And again, this plant has many mechanisms. As I mentioned, it avoids drought by getting as much water as it can with extensive root system, but it can adapt to dehydration as the season progresses in the summer. These leaves, the seeds will be set on the flowers, and the leaves will start to defoliate. Some of our salvias do that as well. I can't think of the salvia that's on the coast. It's the one they use for they light it anyway, but it goes dormant as well in the wintertime and drops all its leaves. And so when I'm hiking over in Griffith Park, I'll see it and I'm like, oh, that's Encilia. And it's not, it's the salvia. Aragonum. This is the buckwheat, common buckwheat. There are many, many different species of buckwheat. Some are very upright and almost like a small tree or a large shrub. And others many are ground cover. And many of these are ground cover. And the only time they get any height on them is when they send up a flower spike in the early spring, late spring, and flower. Some of these plants will go dormant in terms that they will actually the leaves will turn brown. They're very small. There are some larger buckwheats that have bigger leaves, almost like a limonium status. But many of these plants will go dormant in the summer and they'll turn brown. So they may not be aesthetically appealing to the public, but they are yet very much alive. So it's a very interesting plant, and there's many different species, and probably there's going to be a lot of breeding to get some better types of material out there that are more aesthetically appealing to the public during the summer months. I don't have any photos of this, but there are also some ferns that will actually, native ferns of California, especially up in the higher elevations, that will go completely dormant in the summertime, only to come back when the rains return. Okay. So the drought stress response classification. This is another way of looking at things. There's isohydric. And isohydric means that these are plants that regulate water loss out of the leaves. They have a lower photosynthetic rate. There's a trade-off for that, of course. Lower photosynthesis means you don't grow as much because you don't have the carbohydrate accumulation that you would normally get. But as I was mentioning earlier, Encilia is that one of those plants. It, aside from its extensive root system to avoid drought, it gets to a point in the summer where it has to finally go dormant, and it will drop all of its leaves, and you will have basically a crown of sticks. What's nice about Encilia, if you do have it in your yard, is if you do provide water for this plant, it will stay green. It will not die from water in the summertime, whereas some of our native plants do not tolerate summer water very well, like a lot of the ceanothus. So Encilia is a very adaptable plant for out in this area. But again, these plants that drop their leaves in the summertime, or another way of drought tolerance with isohydric plants is they have hairy leaves. So you'll see a lot of grays in southwestern landscapes. And that's because there's either a very waxy layer on the epidermis, which prevents water transpiration out of the leaves, or they're very hairy, very fuzzy. And so they basically have a layer of hairs that prevent water evaporation from the stomates of the leaves. So that's why you see a lot of these gray leaf plants out in the southwestern desert. Okay, and then anisohydric plants. These are plants that allow water loss. Again, Encilia just fits all these models, and the buckwheats. And what happens is these plants will eventually, they still carry out photosynthesis in the spring, but then they allow water loss so that eventually they will just desiccate. But they do not die, they go dormant. So, but the benefit of allowing water loss is, unfortunately, you have to have transpiration to have carbon dioxide going into the stomates. And so you're going to lose some water in order to have photosynthesis, because you need to get carbon dioxide into the stomates, so they need to be open. So what's really interesting about these plants is when you go through the next talks with Dr. Haverde and his graduate students, you're going to see some temperature variations in the plant material from the canopies. And those temperature variations are probably an indicator, we're not sure yet, probably an indicator that some plants are drought resistors and that they have an extensive root system, so that they get deep roots into the ground and they're able to get more water. And so they really will carry out transpiration a little more, so the canopy will stay cooler even during drier, lower water use times. And so these are plants that we have to consider. But the negative part of that with these plants that keep a cooler canopy probably is that they are competing for water because of their extensive root system. So if you have trees and shrubs in that landscape with these ground covers, there may be some competition for the water that's available in the ground. So the closing note is, do not confuse drought tolerance with heat tolerance. There are differences in these two environmental programs, because drought tolerance is one thing, but heat tolerance is another. And one of the good examples of that is a lot of the ice plants that people call ice plants that are grown. Some of them do very well on the coast, but when you bring them inland, they do not take the heat very well. So they may be very drought tolerant, but they're not heat tolerant, and they will burn in the inland heat. And this is a challenge for us because there are many ice plants that come from South Africa. And some of those are inland and some of those are on the coast, cool coastal conditions like we have here. And so we have to know where these plants are coming from in order to understand how they'll adapt to inland climates versus coastal climates. And of course, the other thing we have to be aware of is to watch that we don't get some invasive species when we're evaluating these plants. So the likelihood of introducing a new invasive plant is something we want to keep really low.